Hi, everybody. Today we're just going to go over some poetry terms. So for the grade 5, 6s, you would have got a quiz before March break where I asked you to match the term to the lines of a poem to see if you could notice the poetic device being used in those lines. And a lot of people kind of struggled with this, so I thought it was best that before we start our poetry unit, we go over these terms and kind of discuss them. And I'm actually going to get you to take this information once you're done, and you're going to create your own poetry terms booklet, kind of using your own examples that either you find at home or maybe you find on the internet. So our first definition is stanza. So a stanza is a division or unit of a poem that is repeated in the same form. So sometimes people often get this confused with a verse, like they wonder what the difference between a stanza and a verse is. A verse is only one line of a poem, where a stanza kind of has a repeating sort of pattern. So stanzas can be made up based on a similar number of lines. For example, we see in the poem Just to Say that stanza 1 and 2 are the same because they both contain 4 lines. Sometimes stanzas can be made up based on a similar rhyme scheme or similar pattern. So I'm going to read This Is Just to Say to you, and then maybe you can come up with your own decisions about why you think the stanzas were created the way they were. So this is called This Is Just to Say by William Carlos Williams. I have eaten the plums that were in the icebox, and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet. So maybe you can then kind of think about why those stanzas were broken up the way they were, but that is what a stanza is. It's a group of lines that are kind of placed together in a poem and kind of coupled together either because there is the same amount of lines in each one or because they have a similar rhyme scheme. Speaking of rhymes, we're going to move on to exact rhyme. So exact rhyme is what we're probably most familiar with when we create poetry. It's also known as true rhyme. So normally these words have the same vowel sound, or they sound the same, or they come from the same word family. For example, at the bottom you see cat, bat, and rat. Well, they all come from the at word family, so all of those words have an exact rhyme. True and blue, rake, and cake. And most of us kind of already are familiar with what exact rhyme is, so I'm not going to spend too much time there, but you get the idea. Now, on the other hand, we have something that's called slant rhyme, which is something maybe you're not as familiar with, but this is also kind of known as approximate rhyme. And we see a lot of rappers, such as Eminem, Cardi B, Mos Def. I'm trying to think of who else. There's quite a few rappers who do use this as a strategy, especially when they're creating music. So these are words, they normally will use words that have the same ending sound, but not the same vowel. Like you have, for example, down at the bottom, soul and all. So if you say those two words fast enough, you can make them sound like they rhyme. However, if you look at both of the words separately, they don't rhyme exactly. So that is the difference. So they sound similar, but don't rhyme exactly, and they don't have the same vowel sound. You see there too, mansion in Wisconsin. They don't sound like they rhyme at all, but if you put them to a beat fast enough, you can make them sound like they rhyme, even though the rhyme won't be as exact as a true rhyme. We're going to move on now to rhyme scheme. So on the kind of sort of quiz I gave you before March break, where I got you to kind of label a poem based on rhyme scheme, most of you were okay with this. Some of you weren't so sure what I meant. So a rhyme scheme is just the pattern of rhymes in a poem, and they're just marked using letters. So for example, this poem is called Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. So you'll notice that at the beginning, the first line is, some say the world will end in fire. And that line is labeled A. Now you'll notice the other lines that are labeled A rhyme with the ending of the first line. So we have fire here, and in our next A line we have the word desire. That's because fire and desire rhyme. In our next line, line number 2, it says, some say in ice. You'll notice that that line is labeled B. If you look at the other B line where it says twice, or suffice. All of these words rhyme. They have the same ending, which is ICE. So they are all labeled B. If we move to look at the next line that's labeled C, that line with the word hate. We also have over here great. So they don't necessarily have the same spelling at the end, but when you say both of those words, their endings sound the same. So they both be labeled C because those two words, hate and great, rhyme with each other. So basically all you're doing is you're just labeling a poem or labeling the line of a poem based on its ending. And if other lines have a similar ending or sound similar at the end, you're giving them the same letter name. Maybe as I read this poem to you, you can kind of listen and see if you can understand as I read it why the rhyme scheme of it is the way it's labeled. It's called Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to know that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Now I'm going to give you a chance to try. And I'm going to read you this poem. And maybe I'll give you a few seconds to kind of think about the rhyme scheme. So it says, it's funny how things turned out. I wish I could say I never had a doubt. Truth is, I'm proud to say, you and I have come a long, long way. You touch the lives of people you know. You walk around with a humble glow. You've been a best friend to me, one that will last an eternity. So if we look at the first stanza at the top, it's how things turned out. I wish I'd say I never had doubt. Out and doubt rhyme, they would both be labeled A. And this one would also be labeled A. This I'm proud to say, you and I have come a long, long way. Say and way rhyme, but they don't rhyme these two lines up here that would be labeled A. So these both get a new letter label and they will both be labeled B. So far we have A, B, B. Use lives of people you know. You walk around with a hum. Know and glow rhyme. They don't rhyme with any of our lines at the top in our last stanza, so they would both get a new letter name, and that would be C and C. Last two lines are, you best friend to me, one that will last an eternity. Again, me and eternity rhyme. They don't really necessarily look the same. Their endings don't necessarily look the same, but when we say both of those words, the endings sound the same. But they don't rhyme with any of the lines we've already dealt with, so they get a new letter label of D, D. So our rhyme scheme for this poem is A, B, B, C, C, D, D. Now, your poems won't always be labeled this way. They could have there's a complete range of different rhyme schemes they could have, but this is just an example for you to kind of try. The next term we would have reviewed is a couplet. And all a couplet is it's a pair of rhyming lines at the end. So for example, nature puts on little shows every time it rains or snows. So shows and snows rhymes. And most commonly these are found at the end of Shakespearean sonnets. We won't be working too much with this, but it is important for you to know what a couplet is because you might run into it as we study some of the other poems. Now we're going to move into different poetic devices. These are words you might have heard not only when you've studied poetry, but also when you've just studied other types of literature, but we're going to review them anyway. So the first one is a simile, and that is a comparison of two things using the word like or as. So some examples I have down below are, her hair was like golden grain. So that is a simile because it contains the word like. He was as slow as molasses, and that contains the word as. In the first line, they're comparing her hair to grain, and in the second line, they're comparing the man or the boy his speed to being that of molasses, which if you've ever tried to pour molasses is very, very slow. So these are two examples right there of a simile. The next one is a metaphor. This is like a simile because it is a comparison. However, you're not using the word like or the word as when you're making this comparison. So for an example here, I have, her eyes are two pools of deep blue water. In this metaphor, we're comparing her eyes to the pools of water. However, we're not using the word like or as to do that. So that would be an example of a metaphor. Personification is when it's a type of comparison where we take something that's not human and we give it human characteristics. So I have the example here, the sun peeked over the horizon. So the sun can't peek, it doesn't have eyes, but we are giving it a human characteristic and acting like it does when we describe how it's sort of sneaking up over the horizon. So that's an example of personification. And you will see that a lot in books, in poems. Like I said before, these are all types of devices that you see in all different types of literature, not just poetry, but they're important to know. The next word is imagery. So we kind of talked a little bit about imagery before, not so much in poetry, but when we completed our assignment on visualization, and we talked about how using descriptive words helps to create a better visualization for your reader. That's basically like imagery, except imagery, when we create imagery, we use sort of our five senses to describe a scene. So using what we might touch, taste, smell, hear, and see in order to describe kind of a picture to the reader so they can really try to visualize it in their mind. So below I have an example from I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud by Wordsworth. So it says, a host of golden daffodils beside the lake, beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. So when you read those two or three sentences kind of all together, you get kind of an image of in your mind of the daffodils and how they are acting out in nature. So that is showing you what the author is seeing and kind of taking in as he looks upon the scene. So that's a good example of imagery, using a lot of descriptive kind of words in the poem in order to allow the reader to create kind of a picture in their mind. Alliteration is just the repetition of the same consonant sound at the beginning of words. When we were younger, you probably saw this a lot with tongue twisters. Most times in tongue twisters, all the words used contain the same first letter. So that's kind of what alliteration is. Tongue twisters all contain alliteration, and you will see it in poems as well. So for example, I have here, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. Most of those words start with the letter P. So that is an example of alliteration. Onomatopoeia is a word that has a sound associated with it. You kind of see this a lot, especially in comic books, where there will be kind of like a bit of almost like a speech bubble above an object if it's making a sound. For example, some of these words might be boom, sizzle, sounds that animals make. Those are all words that basically just represent sounds, so that when you see that word, you think of that sound in your head. Hyperbole. So hyperbole is something that's a statement that's exaggerated and that definitely shouldn't be taken literally. For example, I've been running around all day. So I have a picture of Chris D'Elia there. He's one of my favorite comedians, and he does a really funny bit about how people always say that they've been running around all day, but that no one actually runs around all day, and that we shouldn't say that because it's really exaggerated and only babies do that, according to Chris D'Elia. He's pretty funny, but yeah, that is an example of hyperbole. I've been running around all day. So now that we've reviewed your poetic terms over, you're going to create your own ebook of these definitions using Google Slides. Now, I've already set these slides up for you, so you don't have to create it from scratch. Everybody would have received a copy in the classroom. On each slide, you're going to give a definition of the